There's a pattern that has destroyed investors in every generation for nearly 400 years. And right now, the same pattern is forming again. In 1637, the Dutch went insane over tulips. A single flower bulb sold for more than a canal house in Amsterdam. Servants became millionaires overnight. Sailors bought tulips instead of food. Families mortgaged everything for flowers they'd never seen. Then, in 72 hours, prices collapsed by 95%. Families who mortgaged everything lost everything. The Dutch economy froze. In 1720, the South Sea bubble, same pattern. Isaac Newton lost $4 million. In 1929, the stock market crashed, same pattern. .com in 2000, housing in 2008, crypto and NFTs in 2022, tulips, stocks, houses, digital images of apes, the asset changes, the pattern doesn't. Same 5 stages, every time. Here's what should concern you. The pattern doesn't require tulips, tech stocks, or cryptocurrency. It only requires human psychology. And human psychology hasn't changed since 1637. Let me show you exactly how bubbles form, how they burst, and how to recognize which stage we're in right now. On February 3rd, 1637, a trader named Geertruid Scout walked into an auction house in Haarlem. She was there to sell tulip bulbs, not ordinary tulips, rare ones, with striped petals that collectors across Holland would pay fortunes to own. The auction began normally. The auctioneer presented the first lot. Silence, no bids. He presented the second lot. Silence again. Scout looked around the room and saw something she'd never seen before. Fear. Every trader in that room was holding tulip contracts worth thousands of guilders, and every single one of them needed to sell. That afternoon, the most spectacular financial bubble in recorded history collapsed. Within 72 hours, tulip prices fell by 95%. Contracts that could have bought canal houses became worthless paper. And the Dutch courts spent years trying to untangle thousands of lawsuits from buyers who couldn't pay and sellers who couldn't deliver. This is the 5-stage pattern of financial bubbles: innovation, legitimacy, mania, panic, collapse. The same pattern that has repeated in every century since. And once you see it, you'll recognize it everywhere. To understand why the Dutch went mad for tulips, you need to understand what tulips meant in the 1630s. These weren't ordinary flowers. Tulips had arrived in Europe from the Ottoman Empire less than a century earlier. The botanist Carolus Clusius brought the first bulbs to the Dutch Republic in 1593. Nothing in European gardens looked remotely like them. The colors were vivid in ways that native flowers couldn't match. But the truly valuable tulips weren't just colorful, they were infected. A virus called the mosaic virus caused certain tulip bulbs to produce flowers with extraordinary striped patterns, flames of deep red on pure white backgrounds, feathers of purple bleeding into yellow. The Dutch called these patterns breaking. The virus was unpredictable, which meant growers couldn't control which bulbs would produce these rare patterns. Modern science would later identify it as the tulip-breaking virus transmitted by aphids. But in the 1630s, the breaking seemed like magic, a gift from God to reward the patient grower. You planted 100 bulbs, and maybe 3 would bloom into something extraordinary. This biological accident created genuine scarcity. By the early 1630s, wealthy Dutch merchants had begun collecting rare tulip varieties, as later generations would collect art. A garden displaying rare tulips announced to visitors that the owner had both wealth and taste. Botanical records from the period show that a single bulb of the Semper Augustus variety, considered the most beautiful tulip in existence, sold in 1633 for 5,500 guilders. At the time, a skilled carpenter earned about 250 guilders per year. One flower bulb cost 22 years of labor. And that was before the real mania started. Trading initially happened the way you'd expect. Collectors bought bulbs, planted them, and enjoyed the flowers. But Dutch merchants were sophisticated financial operators. The Dutch Republic in the 1630s was the financial center of the world. Amsterdam had more wealth per capita than any city in history, They had invented the stock exchange in 1602. They pioneered maritime insurance. They developed complex trading instruments that wouldn't be seen elsewhere for centuries. It was only a matter of time before someone realized you could trade tulips you didn't physically possess. By 1636, traders began selling contracts for tulip bulbs that were still in the ground. These contracts promised delivery after the spring harvest. The buyer paid a deposit, the seller promised future delivery, and the contract itself became tradable. You could buy a contract in November and sell it in January without ever touching a bulb. This was the innovation that transformed tulip collecting into tulip speculation. The futures market changed everything. Before futures, tulip trading was limited to people who actually wanted tulips. After futures, anyone could speculate. And in late 1636, everyone started speculating. What made the tulip trade feel legitimate wasn't just the profits, it was who was making them. The traders gathering in Amsterdam taverns to buy and sell tulip contracts weren't desperate gamblers. They were established merchants, men who had built fortunes in the spice trade, who owned shares in the Dutch East India Company, who understood markets better than anyone in Europe. When Hendrik de Keyser, one of Amsterdam's most respected architects, began speculating in tulips, people noticed. When Adrian Pauw, one of the wealthiest men in Holland, expanded his tulip garden, it sent a signal. When regents, the wealthy families who governed Dutch cities, began trading, the message was clear. Tulips weren't a fad, they were a legitimate asset class. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602 to trade shares of the Dutch East India Company, became a hub for tulip speculation. Traders developed standardized contracts. Notaries witnessed transactions. Prices were recorded in ledgers that survive to this day. Historian Anne Goldgar spent years analyzing these records. They show an orderly market until they don't. The market had all the trappings of respectability, and the narrative shifted accordingly. Contemporary accounts describe merchants arguing that tulips were better than gold. Gold just sat there. Tulips multiplied. A single bulb could produce offset bulbs, and rare varieties would always be scarce because the virus couldn't be controlled. Holland controlled the European tulip supply. The logic seemed sound, and for a few months, the logic seemed to be confirmed by reality. Everyone who bought tulips made money. Contracts purchased in October doubled by December. By January, they had tripled. The mathematics was intoxicating. A carpenter who bought a single contract for 300 guilders could sell it 6 weeks later for 900. More than 3 years' wages earned in 6 weeks. Why spend years mastering a trade when you could trade flowers? By January 1637, the speculation had spread far beyond wealthy merchants. This is the stage where every bubble becomes dangerous. The moment ordinary people start borrowing money to buy assets they don't understand, at prices they can't justify, because everyone around them is getting rich. Records from the period describe weavers abandoning their looms, blacksmiths closing their forges, servants quitting their positions to trade full-time. Some of those servants became wealthy overnight. A chimney sweep could make more in an afternoon of trading than in a year of sweeping. Sailors returning from long voyages spent their entire earnings on tulip contracts instead of food or lodging. Why work when you could trade? A farmer outside Haarlem, named Henricus Munting, later wrote about watching his neighbors sell cattle to buy tulip contracts. They weren't flower enthusiasts. They had no interest in gardening. They simply believed that prices would keep rising, and someone else would pay more. The prices in early 1637 defy rational explanation. A single Viceroy bulb sold for 2,400 guilders. The bill of sale survives in Dutch archives, and it lists what else that money could have bought. 2 loads of wheat, 4 loads of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed with mattress and bedding, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup, all of that, or 1 tulip bulb. And Viceroy wasn't even the most expensive variety. A Semper Augustus contract reportedly changed hands for 10,000 guilders. Admiral van Enkhuizen, Admiral Liefken, Generaal der Generalen, names that meant nothing to anyone who didn't trade tulips, and everything to those who did. enough to buy one of the grand canal houses in central Amsterdam. The trading itself became frenzied. Contracts changed hands multiple times in a single evening. Some changed hands multiple times in a single hour. A tavern in Amsterdam called the Mania became an unofficial exchange, packed every night with traders shouting prices. Most of these traders had never seen the bulbs they were buying. Many of the bulbs didn't technically exist yet. The entire market had become a speculation on future speculation. Everyone was buying because they expected to sell to someone else at a higher price. The only question was, who would be left holding contracts when the music stopped? The answer came on February 3rd, 1637. The Haarlem auction, where Geertruide Scout tried to sell her bulbs, wasn't unusual. These auctions happened in taverns across Holland throughout the winter months. Bulbs couldn't be moved while growing, so winter was the trading season. The Dutch called it windhandel, the wind trade. Trading in wind, trading in promises. These auctions happened regularly throughout the growing season. What was unusual was the silence. When the auctioneer called for bids, nobody responded. Not because the prices were too high, because every potential buyer was already holding contracts they needed to sell. The panic spread faster than any message could travel. Word reached Amsterdam the same day, Leiden by nightfall, Utrecht by the following morning. Within a day, traders across Holland were trying to liquidate positions. But there's a mathematical problem with a market where everyone wants to sell. There are no buyers. Prices didn't gradually decline. They collapsed. A Semper Augustus contract worth 10,000 guilders on February 3rd was offered for 5,000 guilders on February 4th and found no takers. By February 5th, sellers were offering 2,000 guilders. By February 6th, 1,000. By the end of the week, contracts that had represented generational wealth were essentially worthless. A 95% collapse in 72 hours. The speed shocked everyone, but it shouldn't have. Bubbles always burst faster than they inflate. The human consequences were severe. Dutch legal records from 1637 and 1638 contain thousands of tulip-related lawsuits. The Haarlem Florists Guild petitioned the government for relief. Similar petitions came from Alkmaar, Amsterdam, Leiden, and other cities. The entire legal system was overwhelmed. Buyers who had signed contracts at peak prices couldn't pay. Sellers who had promised delivery had already sold the same bulbs to someone else. The entire chain of obligations was broken. Families who had mortgaged property to buy tulips lost their homes. Craftsmen who had abandoned their trades had no income and no savings. The courts faced an impossible situation. Enforcing every contract would bankrupt a significant portion of the population. Voiding all contracts would undermine the legal system itself. The compromise, reached after months of deliberation, allowed buyers to cancel contracts by paying a small percentage of the agreed price. It prevented economic catastrophe, but it didn't prevent the shame. Dutch society treated tulip speculators the way any society treats people who lost money through greed. With contempt, pamphlets mocked them, preachers condemned them. The artist Jan Bruegel the Younger painted satirical scenes of monkeys trading tulips. The message was clear. Only an animal would be so foolish. Yet the same foolishness would return again and again. The lesson seemed obvious. Don't speculate on things you don't understand. Don't believe prices will rise forever. Don't assume you can sell to a greater fool. The remarkable thing about the Tulip Mania isn't that it happened. Markets occasionally go insane. The remarkable thing is that the lesson didn't stick. Within a generation, the specific details of 1637 had faded from public memory. 2 centuries later, in 1841, Scottish journalist Charles Mackay wrote about the Tulip Mania in his book Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. The book became one of the most influential texts in financial history. It didn't prevent a single bubble. Within a century, England experienced the South Sea Bubble, a speculation in shares of a trading company that promised impossible profits from South American trade. Share prices rose from £100 to £1,000 in months, then crashed to £100 again. The pattern was identical: innovation, legitimacy, mania, panic, collapse. Sophisticated investors lost fortunes. Isaac Newton, one of history's great geniuses, lost 20,000 pounds, roughly $4 million in today's money. He had actually sold early and made money. Then he watched prices keep rising and bought back in at the peak. He reportedly said afterward, "I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." The stock market crash of 1929 followed the same arc. New technologies like radio and automobiles created genuine excitement. RCA, the radio corporation, saw its stock rise 1,000% in 2 years. Barbers and shoeshine boys offered stock tips. Respected institutions piled in. Ordinary Americans bought stocks on margin, borrowing money to speculate. Then the market collapsed, and the Depression began. 12 million Americans lost their jobs. Banks failed by the thousands. The Dow Jones Industrial Average didn't recover its 1929 peak until 1954, 25 years later. The dot-com bubble of 2000. Internet companies with no profits and no clear business model reached valuations in the billions. Webvan, an online grocery delivery service, burned through $1.2 billion before collapsing. Pets.com, an online pet supply company, was valued at $300 million. It went bankrupt less than a year after its IPO. The housing crisis of 2008. Americans bought houses they couldn't afford, assuming prices would rise forever. Banks packaged mortgages into securities and sold them to investors who didn't understand what they were buying. When prices stopped rising, the financial system nearly collapsed. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old investment bank, filed for bankruptcy. The government spent $700 billion to prevent total collapse. Millions of Americans lost their homes. And from 2020 to 2022, cryptocurrency and NFTs, digital assets with no intrinsic value, reached collective valuations in the trillions. Bitcoin rose from $5,000 to $69,000. A digital image of a rock sold for over $1.3 million. A collection of cartoon apes traded for more than the GDP of some nations. Then the market collapsed, FTX imploded, and trillions in paper wealth evaporated. Sam Bankman-Fried, once celebrated as the next Warren Buffett, was arrested for fraud. Celebrities who promoted crypto faced lawsuits. The people who got in early got rich. The people who got in late lost everything, exactly like tulips. Same 5 stages, different centuries, different technologies, different assets, identical human psychology. Greed, fear of missing out, panic, regret. The 4 emotions that drive every bubble. The 4 emotions that make intelligent people do foolish things. The pattern repeats because the emotions driving it never change. The tulip traders of 1637 believed they had discovered something new. They hadn't. They had discovered the same thing investors discover in every bubble: rising prices. And rising prices create their own justification. Look around in 2025. AI stocks trading at 100 times earnings. Companies with no profits valued in the hundreds of billions. Meme coins worth billions with no utility. Tokens created as jokes, trading for more than established companies. It's different this time everywhere you look. The same phrases spoken in Amsterdam in 1637. The same phrases spoken on Wall Street in 1929. The same phrases spoken in Silicon Valley in 2000. The tulip traders believed flowers would make them rich forever. They were certain, they were wrong. The pattern doesn't care what the asset is. It only cares that humans believe prices will keep going up. When that belief breaks, the collapse follows. Every time. Without exception. 72 hours in Harlem. Black Thursday in 1929. The week FTX collapsed. Different eras. Same mathematics of panic. Same human nature. Same devastating results for those who believe the hype. If you've watched this far, you understand something most people never grasp. Financial bubbles aren't random. They follow a pattern documented for nearly 400 years. A pattern that Charles Mackay documented in 1841. A pattern that Anne Goldgar confirmed in 2007. A pattern that repeats in every generation despite all the warnings. And the pattern keeps repeating because human nature doesn't evolve on historical timescales. Subscribe to Capital Origins, because the next bubble is already forming somewhere. A new technology, a new asset class, a new promise of unlimited returns. When you see prices rising faster than fundamentals can justify, when you see ordinary people quitting jobs to speculate, when you hear that this time is different, you'll know which stage you're in, and you'll know what comes next. Hit subscribe. The Tulip Mania happened in 1637. The lesson is about tomorrow. You just need to know where to look, and now you know.